And you put it on slideshow. Okay, good. Okay, so this workshop is about, sorry, this is a webinar, a 1-hour webinar. So the difference you will see on Friday when we have the workshop with module 5, HIV. The webinar is more talking by speakers, whereas the workshop on Friday will be more interactive. So this is also so that we can have a large number of participants. That's why we do it more didactic. So this one is then setting up and conducting online interactive interprofessional workshops. So what we are going to try and do today is to show you how to do interactive interprofessional workshops generically using the Zoom tricks and trays that you got last week. Okay, next slide, Suzanne. So the speakers are Professor Ian Cooper. He's a professor of rural health at Stellenbosch University, and he's the director of the Center for Rural Health at Stellenbosch University. And Professor Hofi Conradi, which you all know by now, I guess, he's also emeritus professor in family medicine. That means he's also failed at retirement. So Hofi has been doing a lot of these workshops. He's got a lot of experience, and I will just be facilitating, looking at the chat room. So at this stage, we ask you that you mute yourselves, or we will mute you. Please put your questions in the chat. You are welcome to raise your hand if you want to ask something. We have built this PowerPoint so to have a question and answer session after each section. But if you have an urgent question, you're most welcome to put it in the chat box. So this is the Sunstripe team, the Stellenbosch University team that's doing this training. Next slide, Suzanne. Let's just look at what is the aim of the training today. So we want to provide some guidelines and pointers to assist learning facilitators to plan and conduct online interactive interprofessional workshops. And please, we are not necessarily the experts. I know there are many of you that has done this already. So we would also like you to share your knowledge and expertise on it. So this is mainly for facilitators teaching Stripe modules, but you can put any content in there. As if you've got a training content, then you can use this format for that. The principles can be applied across various online platforms, although Zoom is the preferred options for this for us in the Stripe project, as we've talked about the Zoom licenses last week. There are separate guidelines for using Zoom for facilitators and participants, and again, Ian showed you the guidelines last week. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Ian now. Thank you, and enjoy the afternoon or the hour.
Thanks, Mariki. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you again. The next slide. So we're going to start by doing a poll. You can see it on the slide, but I'm showing it to you on the screen. There you will have it now. So please, if you can answer those 4 questions on the screen, you can scroll down on the bar on the side if you need to. Your responses are anonymous, but please just start responding to those now.
Ian, yes, perhaps to mention at this point in time, that the host and the co-host can't participate in polls. Is it still correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
I see 33% of you have voted so far. We're up to 50% have voted. I'll give it another short while. Okay, we're up to 75% have voted, so I think that's probably good enough. I'm going to end the polling there and show you the results. So there you go. 25 people voted, and everybody has been involved in facilitating workshops, which I would expect. A number of you have been involved in facilitating Stripe workshops, 64%, which again I'd expect. But not as many of you have actually had the chance to facilitate online workshops. So it's roughly half-half, and just under half have actually facilitated Zoom workshops. So a lot of you have got experience already, others of you less experience. So next slide. We will take you through some of what we have learned and found useful. And we've put that in a document which is available on the website. Next slide, you can see the link on this, this slide if you want to get those, and we can post it in the chat again as well. Also on the website just go back, Suzanne, there's a series of 5 podcasts that we did related to running these workshops, which you might find interesting and helpful. And of course, that's easy to listen to when you're traveling in the car or something like that. Next slide. So what we're going to be covering is the 6 sections in that guideline, which you have set out there, which is really about the ethos, about the team, and then the steps in conducting the workshop. I'm going to start, Wafi will take over, and then I will finish. Next slide. So in terms of the ethos, it's quite critical that we create the kind of ethos that we want in terms of relationships and values. So it is making sure that everyone knows that all professions have an important contribution to make, but not just in words. It's around how we respond and how we conduct the workshop. We must demonstrate that. Demonstrate in an atmosphere that supports learning in the way we interact, that we create a safe space, that we respect everybody, that we treat people as peers. All of those are important. So we're role modeling and communicating that. We're trying to get people involved. The key thing is that it's learning through interactivity. It's learning through the process of talking to others, not through the communication of facts. And to do that, we need to take away hierarchy so everyone feels able to talk regardless of their backgrounds and experiences. Next slide. So if you think about ethos, I want you to think of an example of something that happened in a workshop that I attended recently, where there was something that supported the ethos that I've just talked about, or something that went against it. And if you'd like to share that either in the chat or raise a hand, I'd like to hear maybe 1 or 2 examples of people who've experienced that kind of ethos or something working against that kind of ethos. Is anyone who would like to share that in the chat or speaking directly by raising your hand? No one have anything to share? I went to about experience I had then, where actually it was somebody who was very senior in a small group discussion. It was quite a personal question that was being asked, and that person did not want to share something initially, but after the other people in the small group had all had a chance to share, he actually then felt able, and it was actually, in a sense, his status and his hierarchy was preventing him because he was a very senior, experienced person. But because other people were open and honest, he then felt able to be open and honest and shared something really deep and significant in the workshop. So That's an example of how ethos can work. Next slide. So the next step is creating an ethos, then forming your team. And the key people in the team is the lead facilitator, the Zoom host, the breakaway facilitators, and the administrator. Next slide. But across those people, you need to be taking on responsibilities of getting logistics sorted out, getting steps set up for the participants, creating the online content, identifying and developing resources that back up the online content, because there isn't time to cover everything in a workshop, especially online, and then developing a schedule and program. Next slide. So the administrator's role is, and Suzanne has played those roles for us and is showing the slides for us today. Their role is to schedule the training session on the online platform and conduct the registration. Once people are registered, to send them their pre-readings, and then based on that registration to set up the interprofessional breakaway groups that we spoke about last week when we did the Zoom session. Next slide. Next slide, Suzanne. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. It's me that's causing a problem because I'm looking at two screens at the same time. Yeah, sorry, back to the previous administrator roles, Suzanne, one slide back. So it's also about setting up polls, managing the host function, and organizing feedback. And finally, if you have CME or CPD credits, then it's about making sure that those are sorted out. Next slide. The lead facilitator obviously needs to open the workshop and introduce everybody, but also the ground rules, or start creating that ethos to foster collaboration. The lead facilitator is responsible for managing the main workshop room and thus managing the plenary discussions and supporting the small group facilitators, breakaway room facilitators, and obviously guiding everyone on terms of the logistics. Next slide. Also, to encourage people to post comments and questions all along, and to keep on doing that. It often takes a bit of work to get that happening. One of the ways, if the lead facilitator is having to share a PowerPoint screen and it's not so easy to look at the chat box at the same time, it's to delegate somebody else to do that. To ensure that people know what they must be doing in the breakaway sessions, and then when people have been in those sessions, when they come back, to facilitate feedback to the main group. You will get these slides and you will have the guidelines, so I'm just highlighting key issues from each of them. Next slide. The breakaway group facilitators, obviously it's about facilitating those breakaway discussions, getting people introducing themselves, but also getting people to participate. Often on Zoom, people prefer to be quiet, and one actually needs to name people or take turns or find ways to draw everyone into the conversation, while at the same time making sure no one dominates. And also at the end, it's helpful, in certain way we do it, we always ask one group member to be ready to provide feedback. Not every group gives feedback at the end of every session, but at least to have one person ready always to give feedback. Next slide. The host is the person who has those hosting rights, who sets up the whole thing. And usually the administrator does that, but you can have somebody else who will be the host for it. The host should manage the breakaway rooms, the waiting rooms, and also ensure time management and keep everybody on track in terms of the timing. Next slide. The host can also make sure that people are muted and unmuted, especially when you come in and out of breakaway rooms. People often come back and are unmuted or on video or whatever, and that can be disruptive. So if the host can be making sure that is happening, it's useful. Involving other people in hosting. And there is, you're probably aware, you give private messages in the chat box, and the host can be doing that just as other members of the team can be doing it. So the team can communicate amongst themselves without involving everybody about key issues that come up. Next slide. We've mentioned that, so this is the co-host. Yes, so the host can give other people co-hosting rights. They can also mute. They can also send private messages. It's helpful often to ask participants, if you're having a discussion, to make sure their correct name is come up, because sometimes you see Galaxy XYZ or, you know, Samsung 123 as the name, and to get people to rename. But co-hosts can also rename. They can check, and in the small groups, if you check and get people to rename it, that helps. So next, any comments or questions at the moment that anybody has? Feel free to raise your hand or to put a comment or question in the chat box. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't see any.
Ian, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
So from our experience, like what we are doing today is that the administrator, Suzanne, shares the screen with a PowerPoint. It's actually easier for the presenter, because if you present, then your whole screen fills up. If you share screen, your whole screen fills up. And then maybe a question I want to ask Ian, this is now our second time that we're asking for questions. We're not getting questions. What do you do when that happens in a workshop? Sorry, this is a webinar. Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is a webinar, so it's a bit difficult because the numbers and whatnot, but certainly in a workshop, I would identify a group. I'd say group one, can somebody please, you know, make a comment on this? Or I would say, you know, Hofi, you were facilitating a small group. Is there someone from your group that might be able to give some input on this or something like that? Or, you know, big group to jump on one person is not as comfortable, but that's certainly what one has to do.
There's 2 comments in the chat from Makabiso and Evelyn. Both say it is clear.
Good.
I hope you share the slides. Yes, we will share. Iranius will send the slides and the presentation. So
I think it's a good point, at which I'll hand over to Hofi to continue from here.
Sorry, Ian, there's 2 others that also said, I'm following its understanding and presentation is clear. Thank you. Thank you for putting that down. At least then we know.
It's Hofi here. Can we have the next slide? There we are. So this section of our webinar is about planning the workshop, and you see the 5 P's there. Proper planning prevents poor performance. Next slide. Yeah, so I think when one starts planning the workshop, we have to identify the participants that we want to send the invite to for the registration of the workshop. And that is usually done by the administrator, but the prospective participants, and we want to have the participants representing as many different health professions as possible, because this is what we want to do with these workshops, is to improve interprofessional collaboration. We would normally restrict the participants to between 40 and 50. In the small group, we would like to have a ratio of 5 participants to 1 facilitator for optimum small groups, where each small group member participant can have a chance to speak. Ideally, we would at least have 3 or more professions in such a breakout small room, or for the whole workshop then, at least 3 different professions. So before we then send out the registration, we have a pre-registration form similar to what you filled in when you registered for this workshop, giving the demographics and the different professions and where you come from, your gender, and what your main activity is, whether it's academic or clinical or combination of that. If possible, we ask the participants to preload a picture on the online platform like Zoom, because then we actually see a picture of you when we are in the main group. What is very important is that the administrator can or should pre-organize the small groups so that the small groups are representative of the different professions in the small group. Each small group, we want to have an equal representation of the different professions as possible, as far as possible. And this is what the administrator can do before the workshop. And then it's always good to have just a dry or dummy run with the facilitators beforehand, just to make sure that everything is going according to plan and the facilitators are clear about their role. Next slide. So the next one is then the learning material. So what we have done is the facilitators guide that is presented by the Stripe project in a PDF document or a Word document. We have used that facilitators guide to make a PowerPoint presentation that we use in the main group. And that PowerPoint presentation then uses the patient scenarios for each workshop. So there's a specific patient scenario for each workshop. So we want to familiarize your team, organizing and doing the workshop. They have to be familiar with them. We discuss the PowerPoint presentation, and we can adapt that PowerPoint presentation, the material, to the context. So the context might differ, so we can adapt that material. Pre-read materials, because I don't want to spend a lot of time sharing information or giving information during the workshop. We want to preserve the time for small group discussion. So we identify pre-reading and we email this before the workshop to those participants once they've registered. So as I said, we've developed our own PowerPoint to guide the discussion. You can also develop your own PowerPoint, or you can use the PowerPoint material available in the Stripe modules to guide discussion. What we usually do after the workshop, we have a small reflection, and then we decide on what we should change in the PowerPoints in future. So we adjust the PowerPoint after the workshop. Next slide. So some tips for PowerPoint presentation. So the slides focus on the workshop process. In the breakaway rooms, we have a blank slide or a slide with a blank template where we can fill in during the workshop what we have discussed, the different discussion items that we have, that we can share in the main group. So what we did not make clear is that we usually have one PowerPoint slide that we use for the lead facilitator presentation in the main group, but we also have a shortened, that PowerPoint, we shorten for the discussion and the activities in the breakaway rooms. So there's a shorter PowerPoint presentation that the small group facilitators can use and share in the breakout rooms. So as I said, we want to minimize the number of slides because we would like to use as much time as possible for the participants to discuss. When we make those slides, they should ideally be light on text. Ideally, one should not have more than 3 bullets, and this slide is not a good example because it's got 6 bullets, or 20 words per slide, and I think we definitely have more than 20 words. So this is not a good illustration of a good PowerPoint slide. We can use images and animation to stimulate interest. When we break out into the small groups, there has to be a clear questions that we ask the participants in the breakaway groups to discuss. And as I said, we then display these questions again in that smaller, more concise PowerPoint that we share in the breakaway group. So what we usually also do is we share the patient scenario again and then the questions in the small group discussion, as well as that blank template where participants can put in the answers or the focus of the discussion, the items of the discussion. Next slide. So the third item is the duration in our planning. So we have learned that one should ideally limit the workshop to 90 minutes, not more than 90 minutes. So between 60 and 90 minutes. If your topic for your module of the workshop takes longer, needs more than 90 minutes, then we spread it over 2 workshops of 60 to 90 minutes. On different days in the same week if possible. So maybe on a Tuesday and a Thursday. As we've said before, we use pre-readings to save on lecturing to impart knowledge. We don't want to use the workshop just to impart knowledge. So that knowledge we can share with participants through pre-readings. So we want to use the workshop mainly for interactive small group work. Next slide. So in the planning, we use the Zoom platform, and Stripe supports the Zoom platform. AfriHealth has procured 150 licenses. What is important to realize is that one Zoom license is for one person. So your project should preferably use a number of licenses for administrator and facilitators. So you have to have more than one Zoom license. And if you want more information on this, you can contact Irenaeus at that email address. Next slide. So again, are there any comments or questions about planning the workshop? You can write in the chat box or you can raise your hand and speak up. Maybe while you're writing in the chat box, Mariki and Suzanne and Ian can maybe share any of their experiences in the small group discussions.
Yes, Hoffie, it's Mariki here. What we usually do is in the small groups to ask people to put on their videos, so it's more face to face. So talking about that, I should probably do that myself. You can actually see a person show the face. We find that with the younger students, they actually don't really want to do it. So you would need to, if they've got the good connectivity, to motivate them. There's something in the chat box here. Offie, can I read it? Anna-Marie asked for directions on
Yes,
preparing
please.
for. Okay, the first one is any ideas? Sorry, there's three. Let me just move up again. Some directions on preparing for small and large groups. Make a note of that, Offie. I'm going to read all three. Any ideas on encouraging participants actually to read the pre-reads ahead of the workshop? And from Clara, what is the maximum number of licenses we can have per school? Clara, we don't know that yet. We will have to see how it play out. So I think ask what you need and ask Irenius what you need, and then we take it from there. So then, Offie, encouraging people to do the pre-readings and how to prepare for small and yes.
Anna-Marie actually says that the directions are clear. Yeah, I think probably what's really important is that the facilitators are clear about their role. And the one thing that I think facilitators of the small groups have been worried about is that they don't have the knowledge. So they feel insecure about not having the knowledge. So I think what we have realized, it's not about knowledge. The small group facilitators are there to facilitate the process of the discussion in the small group. And often when people are quiet in the small group, I would actually, in the small group, ask a participant to share their experience. And that way facilitate the discussion in the group. The other was about how to encourage people to do the pre-reads. I think that's a good question. We have been hoping that people will read it. What we've done with the pre-reading, if we use a document, we specify certain pages that the participants should read, so that they're not daunted by a 50-page document that they have to read. So we'll say, here's the document, but please read these sections in the document. I mean, another thing that we haven't done is to have a small poll in the beginning of the workshop where we ask a few pre-workshop questions that may be an incentive for people to do the pre-reading. I hope that answers your questions.
There's no more, so you can continue.
Next slide. So we've said that we have, oops, there we are. Is the previous slide, have we done that? That I think 4, if we can just go through that. So we said we do a pre-registration for the participants, and we provide the mechanism for participants to register and diarize. And I think you've had an experience of that registering for this webinar. It's similar for the workshop. We've already said that it's really important to set up the breakaway rooms before the workshop, ensuring that each small group has a even representation of interprofessional groups, that it's not all doctors or all nurses or all pharmacists, but that they are mixed in the group. And that's where I think it's important that the lead facilitator and the administrator looks through the registrations before the workshop, and then the administrator can then divide the breakaway rooms. We find it very useful to use interactive activities to stimulate discussions, like polls, and you've had an experience of that in the beginning. The chats, where we ask people to comment in the chats, and you can then also refer to the Training of Trainers webinar that we've had last week. And then, as I say, just do a test run beforehand. Things can go wrong. So maybe with your facilitators as a breakaway group, just to do a test run. Next slide. There's just about conducting the workshop. People are not always used to the technology. Next slide.
Sorry to interrupt, just while we're on polls, somebody's asking, what is your preferred poll software? I do.
Yeah, so Zoom has a facility for setting up a poll, and that can be done by the administrator, and the administrator can also include the lead facilitator. So that has to be set up before the workshop. So that has to be done in conjunction, or the administrator and the lead facilitator in conjunction with the team can set up the poll beforehand. One can do it in the workshop, but that's not very easy. So we always do it before the workshop. One cannot save the poll for future workshops, but what one can do is that you can save the template of the workshop. And then if you use that template again, that same poll you can use again. The advantage of using the Zoom poll is that you can share the results. The lead facilitator can see how many people have completed the poll, and then you can share the results. We actually didn't share the results today, but you can share the results and discuss it in the main group. So that's very useful. I think the others can comment. There are other polls that one can use, like Mentimeter and so on. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment, but we found the Zoom poll for this purpose sufficient.
Yeah, if I can just comment, I mean, I think the basic poll is fine in terms of Zoom. If you're wanting to go a bit more elaborate, more creative, things like word clouds and so on, Menti is good, but Menti, the free version, you're only allowed two slides per question, which is a bit cumbersome. Slido doesn't link as well with Zoom, but also Slido works. The advantages of the polling that's part of Zoom is that you can do a large number of questions if you want to. I mean, you can create a whole exam paper if you want in that.
Thank you.
Ian, you're muted. Yeah, okay, thanks. But then the conducting the workshop, so like Mariki has done today, we do an introduction in the main room. We welcome everyone. We introduce the facilitators, and then we start sharing the PowerPoint presentation. We normally share a 2 6 how you mute and unmute yourself, and how the breakaway rooms work. We then also review the workshop objectives and learning outcomes, and then we initiate the workshop content. Next slide. So the lead facilitator follow a template outlining time allocations for each activity. and it shows the cumulative time after each activity on the template, the number of slides for each time period, and we adjust this usually after the workshop. We try to stick to the end time of the workshop. So I'm going to stop speaking because we're nearly end of our time. Can you just show the next slide, Suzanne? This is an example of the template that I have with me when I'm the lead facilitator. So it shows here the slides, the slide numbers that we use. This one indicates whether it's in the main group or the small groups. This is the actual time we allocate for each activity. And this slide then is a cumulative time. So I can see how far I am and whether I'm behind time or ahead of time as I go through the workshop. And this part then obviously describes that the activity that we're busy with. You can see there's a welcome, an icebreaker, a patient scenario, activity 1, poll, activity 2, and so on. And this is just the resources that we use in that activity. Next slide. So again, as we've discussed before, ideally we would like to have 5 participants to 1 facilitator, and facilitators the same for the workshop duration. And if you set that up beforehand, it will remain the same. And also, if you have the workshop over 2 sessions, you can then keep the same groups as well. And we try and keep the activities between 5 and 10 minutes in the breakaway rooms. The administrator assigns the groups, as we said beforehand. She can send a message 3 minutes before the end of the breakaway, or 4 minutes or 2 minutes if she wants, just to say that it's nearly time. Once the time is up, the participants automatically return to the main group, and that is what's nice about the Zoom format. We normally ask then the breakaway groups to report back in the main group, and we ask the facilitator to identify somebody in the group, in each group, to report back. There might not be in the main group always time for every group to feedback, because this is quite takes a lot of time, but we can, after each activity, we can ask 1 group, and then the next time maybe group 1, and the next time group 2 to report back. Next slide. Yeah, so just tips for the breakaway facilitators: acquaint yourself with the software beforehand. The important thing is that you should be able to share your PowerPoint presentation used, that we will provide to the facilitators, but that software in the small group, that is shorter than the main group PowerPoint. Mariki has mentioned about the participants to put on their video. Jot down the names of the participants as facilitator, so that you can keep a track of who has participated and who not, and encourage those who have not yet participated to participate. Allocate a scribe in your group, allocate somebody to report back in the main group. Yeah, and then share your PowerPoint using the screen share. That's what I mentioned initially. Next slide. So we talked about the blank slide, or the blank template that we can use in the breakaway PowerPoint presentation that somebody in the breakaway group can then share in the main group. We talked about encouraging every member every participant to share their thoughts, and maybe sometimes it's necessary to ask people that are quiet. An important point is not, you don't have to give the answers as facilitator. Ask the other participants, what do you think? How would you answer that question? If necessary, nudge the discussion back to the required outcome. The discussion drifts a bit offline. That's just a pun. Participants can share their own screen. And as we say, we encourage the group to summarize their key learning points and monitor the time while in the breakaway room, there is a counter that counts off the time. So you will see how much time you've got left. And Mariki referred to the 10 tips for interprofessional facilitation guideline that's available on the website. Next slide. So again, any questions, or you can speak up if you want. Any questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand.
Yeah, I don't see any, so perhaps we can continue as the time is short.
Good. I think Ian is next.
Yeah, back to me. Thanks, Sophie. So yeah, the last part is then evaluating the workshop. And so we certainly get formal feedback after every workshop, but it's also good if there's time to get a bit of informal feedback from participants at the end, to get a few off the cuff remarks, and then to actually get formal feedback, you can use a variety of methods. We most commonly use a QR code because we use evaluation forms that are provided by Stripe. So they go online to do that. It's best to do it if you can when people are still in the workshop. If you send them a link by email afterwards, getting them to do it, it's difficult. But to do that, you need to finish your workshop with a few minutes to spare, because otherwise people will be rushing to leave. Next slide. So yeah, to remind you, there is that manual. I was going to play you a short sound clip from one of our podcasts about feedback. I'm not sure, Mariki, do you think we've got a minute to do that? We started a bit late.
I think we can. We are sending the participants the PowerPoint, so I think they can listen to both. You can
listen to it yourselves, yeah. So the one is on feedback and the other one is more around the small groups.
Small groups, yeah. Just to say, Ian, that when we did this podcast, it was for the face-to-face workshops, but actually listening to it, one can translate those principles just as well in the online workshops.
Next slide.
Okay, now so, I get group feedback. How do you manage that? My name is Mariki de Villiers, and with me I have Ian Cooper and Francois Coetzee.
Suzanne, stop the next slide, please. Sorry. That was
we
an
did
error.
That just to show you that it can go wrong.
Next slide, Suzanne. Yeah, so this is just an example of the kind of feedback form for a simple workshop that you might want to use. Something, what was most useful, what was least useful, how could it be improved, something simple like that. Next slide. The key thing, though, is that we also want to get feedback from facilitators, and often in a small group, you're not going to send a whole survey out to them. So we usually get the facilitators to stay online for another 10 minutes or so, and we talk through what went well, what can be improved, how can we do things differently, and looking at both the process and the content. And I want to emphasize that because we've said in terms of ethos and everything, that the process is critical. It's about getting people interacting. It's about getting people feeling free to engage with the material, as well as obviously being sure that one is up to date and appropriate with the content. And then one can plan to build it in terms of future sessions. Next slide. So that that's the end, and we acknowledge all the people who've been involved in the Stripe and Sunstripe work. But any further questions or comments will be welcome. We've still got 5 minutes till the end of the hour.
Thanks, Ian and Offie. There was a question about Friday's workshop. Just maybe to say that Offie will present module 5 on Friday as a module in a workshop format. So he will do these things without necessarily saying he's doing it, but then you will see it's very different than the webinar format. So that's why we are hoping to register between 40 and 50 people, depending on how many facilitators we have, as we don't want to have more than 5 people in a group. So please register early. There's something in the chat here.
But maybe that's an important point as well, Mariki, is the numbers in a group. You know, it's a privilege to actually be able to have 4 or 5 in a group, because it's difficult to find facilitators, and you know, and we recognize that. So we have at times we've gone up to 7, 8 in a small group. It's obviously more difficult. Face to face, you can handle, you know, 7 or 8 in a group quite easily, but online it does become more difficult to draw people in. But you know, resource constraints, you've got to sort of play that up against you know, what's ideal and what's possible.
Yes, but at the same time, when we did many COVID workshops for our undergraduate students last year, we actually asked students after the workshop would they be willing to facilitate, and there were quite a number of students that were willing to facilitate the next workshop. Because the workshops are so well structured with the pre-readings and the PowerPoints, and the group supports each other and come up. You don't need to be a specialist in something to be a facilitator. So be a bit innovative and motivate people to do the small group facilitation. Okay. Anybody want to say? Shahan says, thank you. That was great. Thank you, Shahan. We need to look into why we have 70 registered, and we had about between 45 and 50 people on the call. That's going to happen in your workshops also. So one doesn't know if on the day people can't get in or fall off. You will also see as you run the webinar, people go in and out, so you must keep your eye on the waiting room to admit people. That's as people lose connectivity. So
Mariki, maybe just to say that is where the administrator is very useful, like Suzanne. When people fall off and they come and they reconnect, then the administrator stays in the main group. So she can then reassign them to the breakaway room. Suzanne, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, there's something else in the chat here. So Akif asks, does it mean if the participants are many, the facilitators need to increase? Yes. Like Offie said, we'd like to keep, try not to have more than 5 persons per facilitator, or do the workshop again some other time. It's also difficult to manage in a big group, to manage the whole group like that is why this webinar is much more less interactive than a workshop. You will see the difference between what we're doing today and what we will be doing on Friday.
But it is a juggling act because of this whole phenomenon of, you know, so many people registering and people don't pitch up. And we've tried to do things to make sure that, you know, people who sign up, that we register, do participate. But you know, you can plan for 50 people and you have enough facilitators for that, and 30 people join, and then you've got more facilitators than you need, and you might be having to pay them to be facilitated, you know, so it's always a bit of a juggle that in terms of getting the right numbers.
Okay, Cheyenne says, back to the poll question. She says, I agree there is a way to save poll results, but you have to set it up ahead of time. You might have to use the registration feature. I think if you go and look at the recording we did last week, there was something in there. She says she liked taking screenshots of results to be able to report them. Thanks,
Yeah,
Joanne.
that's an easy way to do it. Yeah.
Well, that's very useful.
Now, obviously, the poll will get recorded as part of the video if you're recording the video, but I'm sure there is a way, and I think it's going onto your Zoom web-based Zoom platform to allow yourself to save the results of the poll. But I say I'd need to check that still.
Okay, so Ian, I see nothing else. But then you are happy to wrap up?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everyone for your participation. It's been good to be with you. And last week, I hope that these two bolt together using Zoom, and this week on interactive workshops. And as you've heard on Friday, it'll be actually participating in a practical session of how we do this using a particular module, the HIV module for adolescents with HIV. And that will be the sort of practical application, we hope, of these principles that we've been talking about. So thank you for for joining us, and have a good evening.
Before you leave, we want to take a screenshot. So can those who are still on, can you put on your videos? Suzanne, have you got your phone with you, or somebody can take a screenshot, because we want to use it in, there we go. We want to use it in other presentations. Suzanne, can you take a screenshot? Because I don't know how to do it now.
Thank you, Mary.
I can do it as well.
Okay, hi David. Okay, just stay on for a moment. More people to put on the video so that we can have a nice shot. Okay, that's good. Okay, that's very nice.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
Getting there. Few more.
Still a few more needed.
Are you, Cheyenne, can you also help us with a screenshot?
Tell me,
It's probably in her pajamas.
more beautiful side.
Oh yeah, I'm on my
Masala,
phone.
Yeah, there's one that's
That's
heads down.
almost there.
That's very nice. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Have somebody, have you managed a screenshot? Suzanne?
Yeah, I did one.
Yeah.
You did one? Okay, cool. Okay, thanks everybody.
I missed, but I did it before everybody had joined. So
Okay, you want to do it again?
yeah, but
Okay, just hang on if you've got a moment more.
yeah, sorry, I must just
We must actually include this in the slideshow that you can.
yeah, let me just now we're missing people again. So yeah, I missed the opportunity when everybody was on video.
That's fine.
So,
I've got it.
have you got it,
Okay.
Suzanne? Okay,
Alright.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much,
Okay.
everybody. Have a lovely day.
I don't know if the facilitators want to